Okay, I'd like to call the city council work session at meeting together at 6 p.m. Today we're work session joined with the Planning Commission to talk about 50-year plan development code amendments. Got a couple planning commissioners here, and we are joined by Heather Austin from 3J Consulting and Community Development Director Lori Joseph Oliver. If you'd like to take it away.
Great, thank you, Council and Planning Commissioners. I'm glad you could join us tonight. So again, yeah, what we're going to do is I'll just go ahead and share the code here, and we will go through it page by page, and feel free to ask any questions that you may have. Again, this is some of it's just in support of, our updated housing study and economic opportunities analysis, although what we're looking at tonight really is just some code cleanup that we're doing since we have the code kind of opened up as a part of this project. So go ahead and kick it off and hand it over to Heather.
Thank you, Lori. Pleasure to be here with you this evening, Mayor, Council, and Commissioners. This work that you see before you is 5 chapters that I've worked with staff on over the last few months. We did take a lot of this to the Stakeholder Advisory Committee for your 50-year plan. Some of it did not go to that body because it's more either cleaning things up, clarifying the language, or it's straight state law that has changed that we need to move forward as part of this project. So we'll try to identify those things, especially if there are questions as we go through, kind of talk about where the ideas came from and why we're proposing the language as we are. And then the purpose of this meeting is to get your feedback so that when we move forward into adoption hearings, we've already addressed your issues and concerns and made sure we've represented this body as well. No problem.
To make you.
So of the 5 chapters, I think the first one we're presenting, 17.106, is the biggest change. We've tried to basically rewrite the whole chapter to make it flow a little better, be more consistent with other chapters that we see in other jurisdictions for parking. The firm I work for, 3J, we have a private development wing in our planning department. So I pulled that group to say, what do you like to see in parking codes? What makes it easy for you when you're working in jurisdictions? They work all over the state in Washington. And the number one thing was just really quickly getting to the standards of how many parking spaces are required and really having things in one space. So the current code as it sits today for Scappoose, there's some applicability standards scattered in several different subchapters. There's some dimensional standards written and then in a table, but kind of in 2 different sections. So what we tried to do was just look at the whole code chapter and make it make sense first off. You'll notice too when we get there that we didn't make a lot of changes or recommendations to the amount of parking that you're requiring. We just address those items that are not currently in your code, so those middle housing types. But before I jump into that, let's start with this page that we're on. The top is just looking at retitling what to match what we retitled to, simplifying it, making more consistent with what you might see at other cities. Down. The first item that is a bit substantive is applicability of provisions. Currently, we apply this parking code to anything that goes for site development review. But because in Scappoose, a conditional use doesn't automatically require a site development review, in some cities you do go through both in tandem. But since we don't, we wanted to make sure that you would be at least required to review and show how you comply with these parking standards if you were just doing a conditional use without having to do a site development review. So that's the addition of 17.130 there. If you have questions, please just stop me because I can get on a roll and okay. On the second page of the parking code, we looked at just compiling all of those applicability standards that were sort of scattered in different places throughout the code and just clarifying who's required to provide information regarding the parking on their site and how you have to look at that. A lot of this language is existing in your code, most of it actually. It's just been moved to location. Okay, so here the area that's struck out, we struck out some of these dimensional standards that are appearing later in a table. And we'll move down to the minimum off-street parking requirements. So the one change to the table of what types of uses requires parking is adding triplex, quadplex, cottage housing, townhomes, and accessory dwelling units. And those are, we had a chance with this body. We definitely spoke a lot with your stakeholder advisory committee about the middle housing types and bringing those in for some parameters here. In the past, a triplex or a quadplex would have been reviewed as a multifamily structure, but now we're differentiating that. And with the state looking at HB 2000, excuse me, HB 2001, we considered duplex, triplex, and quadplex to try to look as close to single family residential and act as close to single family residential as we can. And so when we say one space per dwelling unit, you're allowing the opportunity of a dwelling type like that to be in a neighborhood with other single family uses without having to create a parking lot. So if you go to a standard of 2 spaces per dwelling unit, as soon as you get to a duplex, you require 4 spaces, and all of a sudden you're starting to get into like a parking lot look. Whereas if you allow it to be 1 space per dwelling unit, there can be more cohesion in the neighborhoods of how those spaces look. Also, Lori pointed out that if you're in a single family neighborhood, there's probably more on-street parking than if you're in a multifamily area or your expanded commercial zone where multifamily might need a higher level of parking to address the parking need. So that's where those recommendations are coming from.
I had a quick question. It's probably dumb, but do any of those require garages?
They don't require garages. I don't believe.
They don't.
Cottages usually not, or do they? Is it-
No, they don't. They don't require a garage. They just require a parking space. It can be interior. A lot of times we will see, especially for like a townhome, usually those will have a garage. So the garage does count, and then the driveway would count as well for an additional spot.
If you were a house, you could have a single car garage and then a spot right behind it on the driveway.
Yeah.
It's 2.
I'll point out also that by 2025, which is about when we think these code standards will be taking place, Scappoose will be required to limit their duplex requirement to 1 space per dwelling unit because the state lowered the threshold. So when we started this project, the threshold for addressing duplexes as part of middle housing was 10,000 population. And so that was on the horizon and something we were talking about, but not something we were required to do. State has now lowered that to 2,500. So you and Scappoose are now meeting that threshold of population and required to require no more than 1 per dwelling unit for duplex. Same with accessory dwelling units. Cities at 2,500 cannot require an additional parking space for an AD.
That other things too are affected at the 10,000. I mean,
10,000 was the duplex only and ADU. Now the threshold jumps from 2,500 up to the 25,000, which is where you see the triplex, quadplex, cottage housing, and townhomes.
What is the reason for that, if I may ask?
To increase opportunities for housing, to reduce the amount of land needed to provide each housing unit, limit the amount of space taken up.
Before we move out of this section, I noticed that we have 1.5 spaces sort of allotted throughout the document. But then I saw in another section within the document that said if it says 1.5, it will be counted as 1.
That's a great question. Yeah, that is funny, actually.
Yeah.
In this case, we wouldn't. So in this case, when we are telling them what they need to provide, we do use the 1.5 space per unit for their required parking. If, and this comes into case like if you have a lot of the code is based on like a percent in certain square footage, you need so many stalls.
Correct.
In that case, you're going to get sort of some odd numbers. When say it comes out to be, 16.7, they're required to provide 8 because obviously you can't provide a part of a parking stall.
so 0.5 and above, you have to round up. Is that what you're saying? So if it's required 4.5 spaces, you get away with 4?
Yeah.
We roll forward to page 10. The language reads, fractional parking space requirements shall be counted as a whole space. So 1.2
Yeah.
requires 2.
Hmm.
A fraction. And that is a great point. I think when you get 1.5, it's always assumed that it's going to be multiples of that.
Correct.
Okay.
They start at, in residential, they start in multifamily, which is 5 units or more, so 1.5 times 5 at the smallest.
Got it. Okay, thank you.
Welcome, that's,
That's a good.
yeah.
So I'm just gonna roll ahead. We don't have any else when I see red again. And we didn't change any of that. Okay.
I think we're here on page 10. So the first thing was, again, removing those dimensional standards, which appear just on the next page in a table, noting that fractional spaces require you to count it as a whole. Cities go both ways on this. Some allow you to round down at under 0.5, but we just wanted to make sure that we were capturing the spirit of providing enough parking. Those changes. Let's see, we pulled more general provisions together here. This was another section where there were a few things in the background information in the applicability section, and then a few things in other chapters. So a lot of this is existing language. Yeah, we can move down. So here's that table that is existing in your code. So it does give you your minimums and your widths for your drive aisles, and if you're at an angle, this is what you have to provide. So it's pretty clear. And when a table gives the dimensional standards like this, I like to just refer to that as opposed to writing it out in the code. This is so much easier for someone to look at and apply. Sample illustration 1 is existing, and we're going to update that as part of this. We're going to have some design help to change out some of the graphics. This is the first one that will be changing. Okay, so here we start talking about public works design standards. So we wanted to make sure that anything that we're requiring also meets with city engineering and public works standards to make sure that they get an opportunity to make sure that their standards are being met. At the bottom of this page, there's pavement. This is a brand new section. This is based on the city of Beaverton's section on pavement, so that it increases the life of the pavement, or not guarantees, but promotes longer lasting surfaces so that they're being replaced less often. I believe this has been reviewed by the city engineer. And
Do you have a question? I noticed going through this, I just trying to understand. So if we go to section K, subset C, third sentence down, towards the end, it says, or shall be 4 inches of Portland cement concrete. And then continues on. I'm just curious, what is Portland cement concrete? Is that some special type of concrete?
great city engineer question.
No, it's just what they call,
Not a company or anything. It's actually what they call the concrete.
They call it that in Seattle.
Okay, I was just curious because I was like,
Industry standard
Yeah.
language.
okay, thank you.
CC.
I've got some questions on section K. First is just, why is this here and not referring to the Public Works Code?
A good question. Lori, you had a preference to include this. Do you have a?
I mean, Chris and I have talked about it. Do you have a preference having it here versus in the code? Well, I can say one thing. This is for on-site. Public Works design standards is for public roads.
That makes sense.
Okay. I've got a couple of different notes here. Is there a way that this could actually point to specific standards instead of having, because you've got some detail in here that may change in future? And
Yeah.
you've got one of these has a ASHTO T-99 standard. I'm wondering if it would make more sense to try to point to a standard rather, that way if the standard changes, you don't have to open the code up.
Yeah, that's a great comment. And I do typically recommend that if you have a TSP that gives roadway standards or something, you're referring to your TSP rather than putting the specifics in here. I think definitely we can look into that and see if we can find standards that we can point to here. That's a great comment.
Do you have any comments on that, Chris? Where you would
Well, I don't.
house that? I just
I
don't.
mean, ASHTO T99 is gonna stay the
Yeah.
same.
Yeah.
Not really gonna change. They'll update the language, but that number stays the same.
Okay.
Oh,
Yeah,
okay.
so that, it's the current, it's always the current standard.
So you don't have a concern that this is gonna change so much that we would,
Maybe this is akin to saying ADA standards, like it's still gonna be
It
ADA
is, yeah.
standards. Okay.
Those compaction standard numbers don't change.
okay.
Just update the change.
Moving on, or did you have another one?
Well, one other one on the pavement strength, you call out an 80,000 pound truck. What do you mean by that? Because an 80,000 pound truck, you're talking a standard semi.
Mhm.
That's actually the gross vehicle weight,
Ah,
not the vehicle itself's weight.
gotcha.
So if you want to use that, you should put a
GWV.
yes.
Gotcha. I'll check into that. This literally comes straight out of Beaverton's code, so I'll make it more clear for the
that
It's
a-
set up to handle.
fire truck.
Yeah.
Fire truck.
This is really what that's trying to say is it's designed to handle an engine. That's sort of their standard.
I
So
think we should reference standard fire truck then, or should we stick with
mean,
the poundage?
you put in GVW, that's I think the simplest change.
Okay, yeah.
So I'd be surprised if you over 80,000 W even have.
Well, concrete.
I don't think it'll hurt.
Yeah, yeah.
Specific, a little more specific. Great, do that. Okay. We're on page 12. So that was now we're on 13. Access drives, again, we link it to public standards as they have driveway standards for where it matches the public right of way.
Very quick,
Mhm.
do we have a department that goes out and sees broken driveways and that need to be repaired? Monitored.
It's not something that we're out actively looking at. As with most of our code, it's gonna be complaint driven, or if staff is somewhere and notices, there's an issue going on here, we might initiate, having them repair. Chris, any other comments on that? Or if it's a redevelopment, we might pick that up.
We do have some property owners that will come in and are rebuilding their driveways because they know they're damaged. There was a pretty good campaign to get Fred Meyers to repave their parking lot. So there's we don't have a team that goes out and
Also, I'm sure if there are complaints, you would
Mhm.
investigate.
Right,
Correctly.
Yeah, oh, absolutely. And if there's an ADA concern, so we've highlighted, ADA concerns, in places and notified, property owners that they need to take some action because it's an ADA route in particular. And, so we do sometimes.
And the sidewalk improvement, thing we have is sidewalks.
Yeah.
Not really between your driveway or a business's driveway.
Well,
Depending on.
And if it is part of the sidewalk.
Driveway drop, then that would still qualify.
it's part of the walkway. It's part of the sidewalk.
But come up when somebody sells a home, sells it. Standards.
No, we haven't seen that yet related to a home sale, but you've given some ideas now that that'd be a good thing.
I'm gonna move
To
forward.
the bottom here. So here, we currently had artificial lighting standards for parking facilities, and we're just trying to clarify and simplify. And this is the first time I'll say this, but I'm hoping to say it a couple times because it's really important. When we are applying standards to anything related to residential, in this case, it could apply to a multifamily development or a mixed use. We have to be clear and objective. That's also a new state law. We have to use numbers in place of statements. It can't be consistent with or in the spirit of. It has to be pretty clear, cut and dry. Anyone can look at it, know what's required, and anyone can look at it and apply the standards and either approve with conditions or deny. So here we're just changing it to be 3-foot candles. That's what parking areas are moving forward. Let's see, on this page, we referenced the new word for single family attached, which is townhouses, and that comes out of our HB 2001. So we've changed that throughout the language. This 1 and 2 are together now, so it looks really funny, but that all other is intentional, so that as all other off-street parking shall be located not further than 400 feet. I just compiled those two sections, and when I looked at it again, I thought, what's going on here? But that's what's going on here. So when you see a clean version, it'll look much better. The numbers make sense. Okay, and then if we scroll down,
A question about actually some of the language that hasn't changed. So what would be now R3, talking about carpool spaces? So would it be safe to assume that like OMIC and the new Cascade Tissue Building does have some spots reserved for carpool?
Yeah.
Use? Okay. Are they used? Do we have any like utilization rate?
I don't know. That's not something we necessarily hear on the back end after they're approved.
I would suggest maybe if there's a way to reach out and see if this requirement is right sized for what the actual usage is, might be good.
And how are they marked?
There's signage. Usually they'll have one sign that kind of splits between two stalls indicating that they're.
down to 15. Here we talk about, so up above are some requirements of drawing the plan to scale and things. Those are generally taken care of on your application forms, and taking that specificity out of here allows you to make changes to it on your development code application. A lot of jurisdictions are going all virtual now, and so a lot of codes say however many paper copies. So just removing that from the code is really helpful. It gives you some nimble staff actions to be able to take in what's appropriate when an application is submitted. Scrolling down to our new X, this is also a state law requirement. It's required of the building permit, but in order to let your applicants know about it up front, it does make sense to put it in this code so that you're seeing how it can work on the site and making that initial determination that no less than 20% of vehicle parking spaces are ready for electric vehicle charging in multifamily. This 20% is applicable everywhere in the state. If a city is in a metro area in the state, it's actually 40%. That's called a climate friendly and equitable community standard. But here you're at 20%, and that's what you're required to do. Y and Z, I believe, are existing. Those are those are new?
Nope, those are existing.
Oh,
They just
existing, yeah.
moved place.
On X?
Mhm.
Is this the exact language that's pulled out of the
I
state?
did.
law?
I pulled it right out of the ORS.
Okay.
Yeah.
Do
We
we
can
have,
adjust it if it would make more sense, but I just want.
Well, reduce it or not, it's provisions. Or it's a fourth line down, provisions
Provision.
for.
Yeah. And generally that's like conduit and
Yeah.
showing that you have yeah.
That's what I wanted
You would
to.
rather see maybe conduit and.
No, well, I would, if I was writing it, doing it, I'd put in the conduit, but
Yeah,
yeah, okay. Just didn't want to be requiring 20% of capacity to be built in initially, because that's a lot of unused capacity.
Oh, correct.
gotcha.
for that.
Yep, just provisions.
Mhm.
and so we have businesses right now that would qualify for that?
If they were getting a building permit, that would trigger this.
So you're grandfathered in?
We're grandfathered in right now.
What would require a major remodel or something changes? Would that kick in?
Yeah, so we have triggers for when a new site development review application is required. And so if they hit the triggers for a major modification, then they would have to apply for new site development review, and then this would be applicable at that point.
Question on Z. So if I could just kind of get a practical example of how this would work. So as I'm reading this, I'm thinking about, say, like Peak Performance, the gym, the accountant, right? They're two separate buildings, two separate businesses, kind of share that parking area, but operate in the same business. I think in the same business hours. I mean, I feel like Peak operates all the time. But how would that scenario work with the language of Z?
So I can tell you specifically that in that case, there are two different legal lots there, and they are actually meeting their own requirements on each legal lot in that case. But there's some cases like for instance, um, the movie theater shares some parking with the Columbia West Shopping Center, so where Sims and Ixtapa are. And so we basically look at the number of spaces each use needs, and if they do have the opportunity to share, then they have to provide legal documentation to the city to make sure that that's actually going to work. So that when those uses are most active, they have the parking available for their use. You don't see it very often, but it does provide a little flexibility when they're a little short on parking.
On X, I would, right at the beginning, strike privately owned. It's possible for other agencies to own commercial property.
And this was straight from the.
This is straight from the code, so I don't think you have to, but you
I don't think the
Yeah.
intent is to allow
commercial, allow a public
public agencies
away
to
from.
be able to avoid it.
Okay. I think that makes sense. All
You have another one on that.
Well, on Z, I would have the agreement you talk about if it's terminated. I'd make sure say that there has to be how is this being terminated? That should be decided up front rather than just the agreement ends and the city is left who's responsible for what.
So clarifying in the language here.
Yeah, because you've presented, a contract that says how you're getting into a deal with somebody. That contract should also cover how are you getting out of this.
So if a joint use agreement is subsequently terminated per the terms of the agreement,
Yeah, something like that. Just make sure the contract isn't only for the creation, that it covers the potential other side.
this is existing language. I'm looking at
Yeah, we could look at that, yeah, and see what makes sense there.
terminated so maybe a suggestion like that, and we can talk about.
Okay. Presumably if a different use moves into an existing building, maybe they don't need as much parking, and so they wouldn't need to jointly utilize.
Yeah, but if they pull out of that and they say, we only need these 5 spaces, not 10, now who's responsible for the 5 that they're no longer?
Okay, double A.
Double A is new. Yes. So currently we do not allow on-street parking to count for your off-street parking requirement. So this is what we would consider a land use efficiency measure, where you do allow some amount of your off-street parking to be counted as on-street parking. But here we have made very strict requirements for how you do that. The pavement must be at least 32 feet wide, so it's not on narrow streets. There has to be a length of 23 feet. 20 is used in a lot of other jurisdictions. You added the 3.
I just looked in the table to see what a parallel length needed to be, and it was 23, so
Okay.
I made that amendment
So
to
made it
match. Yeah.
Consistent with what we already require
Right,
for a parallel parking spot. Yeah. But you do in town have 45 and 60-degree parking. So making sure that that has the appropriate amount of curb, as well as 90-degree. Comments on that? That's new.
One thing is, how's that affect over here with the right of way down the railroad? Are they going to be able to use spots across the street to be counted as their parking?
Yeah, so we had talked about that previously with the owner, just because there is a provision where you can provide an alternative study to look at how much parking would serve your use. We were going to get creative with that one, I will say that, but they had proposed to count on-street parking. So this does help. But
Could be
still,
across the street, not just
It
on.
specifically
this
says a
is a
budding.
butt.
yeah, this code is specific that it has to be on their frontage abutting. I don't necessarily see a conflict though, but if someone wants to use this provision and then also use the alternative parking standard, they could do both. And that would be a decision the planning commission has to make.
I have a question on that one as well. Is there a requirement that a sidewalk also goes in?
So for new development, we do require that sidewalks are provided if it's adjacent to a substandard street, and it basically makes sense to require that full dedication. There are instances where there's just an established street width and everything's built out on both sides of the street. In that case, we'll go with the existing right of way, won't necessarily require a dedication. But in that case, that development would either already have sidewalks or we would match existing sidewalks to the north, south, east, or west of what's already there. So, but typically, yes, they're building new sidewalks with a new development.
And Lori alluded to that existing language that is showing up as B here. It is existing, even though it's in red, but it was moved from a different section. So this is that alternative.
Oh yeah, the AB, yeah.
Does this then limit the city from using that space for anything in the future because
No,
dedicated? Then
Nope,
that
that's-
should be very clear.
it's right here, D, public use required for credit. On-street parking spaces counted towards meeting the parking requirements of a specific use may not be used exclusively by that use, but must be available for general public use at all times. They cannot sign it for their use or anything like that.
City couldn't decide that we needed a mid-block crosswalk there.
Correct. We would need to provide that for them. Keep it open for their use. Typically, I don't know,
I
Chris,
can't
do you have
think
any?
of a lot of
Yeah,
times when that
just
would
don't-
happen, but I do think about
right across the street.
where it's gonna have to be a two-way at some point. And I don't wanna have a situation there where somehow somebody has a say on that and the city doesn't
No,
use its ability to say on-street parking.
right. It
City
is
control.
in the right of way, so the city would always control that.
If you scroll up just a little bit too, it does say an on-street parking space shall not obstruct a required visual clearance area and it shall not violate any law or street standards. So that does give you the ability to use the TSP and ensure that anything that's coming in the next 20 years would be.
Then 1C,
Mhm.
90-degree parking. I don't think that should even be in here because that's gonna require a backing movement in the lane of traffic.
Yeah, it's definitely not something we would hardly ever see. Although we are proposing to we have an opportunity to pick up some right of way from ODOT and the rail here on Northeast First Street. And we are proposing to put in some public parking there. There would be backing movements. However, it's an opportunity we really would like to take advantage of.
And I'm not thinking what happens if somebody wants to, on an arterial, have cars backing in and out of the park.
We would say no.
Okay, just want to make sure it's around.
And so would ODOT.
Okay, so that gets us to 17, I believe. I don't have any. So this is existing. It's a similar use determination rather than a modification of parking requirements here. We changed that around. Page 18 is your,
One
oh yeah.
bit.
please.
At the top of 17, it says the site has a bus stop with frequent transit service.
Mhm.
What does that mean?
I think
Is
it's
currently-
defined, yeah.
Sorry.
Every 15 minutes is what frequent during the peak hour.
Okay.
You have that defined?
Oh, I don't know.
think we
Is
do.
it not?
Yeah.
We should define
Because-
that.
No,
Yeah.
we don't.
If you were comparing to CC Rider, I mean, 4 times a day would be frequent compared to what they do now.
Right. We'll add some.
Define frequent transit service.
This is just a title change.
Yes, and then your bicycle parking standards are your current bicycle parking standards with the small exception of changing out planning commission to review authority because we've spoken in the past about the site development review having a staff level option of review at some threshold. So this clarifies the language that it's whoever's making the decision. The red language is your existing. And then if at the bottom where it says multifamily, now it's at 5 instead of 4, that's because we moved that quadplex into its own category. So it's no longer multifamily. Page 19 is new. We did spend some time with the stakeholder advisory committee determining some parking area landscaping standards so that we could get some minimum landscaping in there. Currently, we have a buffer of 4 feet, 4 square feet per linear foot or something of separating you from the street, but we wanted to add to that and have perimeter landscaping also separating you from adjacent properties, unless you're, of course, sharing the parking. And then having some level of interior parking area landscaping. This was a big discussion item at the stakeholder advisory committee, just making sure that we were balancing out the cost of doing business with getting these greener spaces. So some smaller businesses might find it really difficult to dedicate the space and keep up with the maintenance of landscaping when they're trying to just get a small business up and running. So the stakeholder advisory committee did come up with these different thresholds. The first, which is B, would affect anyone who's required to provide between 50 to 99 off-street parking spaces. And then the step up from there would be you're required to provide 100 or more parking spaces. So it has a slightly higher threshold of square footage of interior parking required. And we have a new graphic for this as well that we'll put into the code, so it'll be really easy to see how this is calculated. But it will help with the the city's been looking at their tree canopy and trying to increase that, reduce heat island effects. So this will hopefully help with that and won't be impactful to smaller businesses. Right, then your existing,
You have on the loading and unloading driveways,
yeah,
you define what a meeting place is anywhere. Like I know the general intent, but I could think of a coffee shop very easily being considered a meeting place designed for more than 25 people at once. So then a coffee shop would require a drive-through.
Yeah, I don't think it's defined anywhere. I don't know if you've seen this before, or you have adjusted language
I
for
definitely could.
clarifying.
I mean, I can look for language to clarify. I think it's something like, or other place where people gather for transportation purposes, like defining something like that. 'Cause this is really, yeah.
Saying meeting place leaves a lot of stuff open.
Yeah, we can work on wordsmithing that. I don't think we did anything with this section, so I haven't
No.
put my brain to it yet, but we can.
And the off-street loading again is just straight from our code, is just rearranged into a different location.
The one thing I was thinking, Scott, is like at Veterans Park, cars are constantly dropping kids off and dropping kids off. But are they required to have, do they just stop right in the middle of the road and drop them off?
I don't think, well, first of all, when Veterans was built, I don't know this language was exactly the same. It could have been. I don't think though, if we were to have an application like Veterans come in again, that we would necessarily think to apply that code to it. It's really, although it does function that way at times, probably during games and things. I think of it more in terms of like a school.
Definitely a school.
School, but like at
Every day.
PCC had to provide, an unloading area. Because the buses are pulling in and stuff, so.
You just don't want somebody to be able to use this as an objection. Because
Sure.
that would be an easy way to kill something that you don't agree with.
I'm just thinking that Grabhorn, if we do a park there, is there gonna be a spot to drop them off to run out? Would that qualify or?
Typically, again, I don't think we would apply that unless there was a strong desire for it. I mean, the city would ultimately be coming up with a plan for that. So, if there was direction that we wanted that, then we could incorporate it, but it wouldn't be something we would typically do. That is the end of
That is 106. Yeah, and we did get a chance at our last, it's been a while, but I feel like it was last winter that we did talk about quite a bit of 17.120, your site development review chapter, and that's where we talked about the different review types and having a staff level review. So we just wanted to bring back the pieces that we've now completed. And the first page here, phase development, we did this in a few different spots, including subdivision as well, but just changed the time periods for things from 1 year to 2 years. There's been a slowing of how things are processed and how long financing and things take. So wanted to make sure that people weren't constantly like running up against these deadlines and not being able to fulfill their plans because we got them so tight. And this is very common. A lot of cities have changed to 2 years for
And I
this.
would say in most cases, for site development review, they do ask for an extension. And so under our current code, they can ask, it's a 1 year approval, and then they can ask for one year extension. And even then, sometimes they're up against it. So especially with like supply chain issues and financing, as Heather mentioned. So this just provides more flexibility. The last thing we want is to go through all the effort of getting something approved and then have their approval run out for no other reason than they just needed a few more months. So this just provides more
They
flexibility.
still have the ability to appeal for one more year after.
Yes, yeah, we left that in. So total of 3, that should give them time to get everything in order and be able to get that permit issued within that time frame.
The planning commission has been struck and the new terminology is review authority. Can you just give me a synopsis as to why that change to accomplish?
Yes, so review authority is intended to accomplish allowing different levels of review. So at the last work session that we held here, we talked about having some site development review applications that met some certain thresholds that would be reviewed by your staff,
Yes.
and they'd be the review authority.
Got you.
Then when planning commission's looking at those, what we eventually will probably call a type 3 quasi judicial review, where there's a little more discretion involved or there's more standards to apply. They'll be the review authority. So review authority is an encompassing term that is anyone who's making the decision who's been granted that authority by your
Okay.
development code. Should add that definition. I'll add
That
review
would be-
authority to the.
Yeah, that would be great.
That's a good idea.
Okay, and then minor development, just clarifying the language here. And this is a planner level. So this used to say that the planner's review. So we could say the review authority here, but minor modifications will always be at the planner level. Clarifying language when it's just small changes. Oh, for the planner. I think I'll just change it to review authority if there's not. Yeah. Just to be consistent. Okay, and then 23 and 24 application requirements, just clarifying that. No substantive changes. On 25, we changed where we listed drainage courses and drainage patterns just to put it in with the engineering report. Page 26, we talk about what's required on a landscape plan, clarifying that, and then we talk about the photometric plan, meeting Illumination Engineering Society of North America and Dark Sky Standards. So those are both pointing to the reference that would be able to change and then. Okay, approval standards and changing out approval authority. So here we get into a lot of that clear and objective language. We really tried to add numbers where we could to preserve and maintain natural drainage ways. And here we require, as as required by the geotechnical report. So geotechnical report will give recommendations and we'll be able to apply those directly.
I have a
Looking
question
at-
real quick. Sorry, I know we're trying to get through this.
Okay.
Just geotechnical reports. Is there a governing, is there a standard company, department, industry that they're all issued like same standard across, or are these independent companies that issue these things? What I'm trying to get at is to understand when we say geotechnical report, where's the confidence we have that these are valid, legitimate, there's no bias in these reports that could potentially create an adverse effect for the community down the road?
That's a great question. A geotechnical report has to be compiled by a geotechnical engineer. So it'll be stamped by an engineer who's held to an ethics requirement and who has met professional certifications.
I have a quick question too. 17.1. Et cetera. Got the same thing on approval of standards.
So we have approval of standards.
In 080.
Oh, at 0.080 and at 0.180, is that what?
Yeah, 6 and 20. Descriptions.
Well, in 080 on page 23 specifically pertains to a modification. So just if you're coming in to make a change to something that's already been approved, is existing. And then 26 refers to brand new. So we could call that site development review approval. Clarify.
Just didn't want to.
Yeah, sure.
It's not a bad.
Sure. 18.120.180 will be SDR.
Yep.
Okay. So moving on to 27. You'll see in D, privacy and noise, we used to say that the building couldn't be oriented in a manner which doesn't protect private spaces. So now we're saying specifically, you can't put a window or a deck or a balcony within 15 feet of a property line of a lower density area. So that's how we clarify and make the language objective. We tried to go through and just remove anything that was not clear, not able to objectively apply. Private outdoor areas, again, 6-foot high fence, site obscuring wood, metal, non-chain link, masonry, or vegetative screen. If anybody has ideas of other materials, we're happy to include them. You can put as many materials as you want in the list, but you can't say or like material. So that's where, if anything occurs to someone like, oh, my cousin's sister's friend has a blah, 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 and it's awesome, like, let's put it in there and it could be an option, you know? So just going through this section, unless there are any questions, it's all cleaning up the language to make it clear and objective. 28, 29. So there's a lot of strikeout as well. We did go through and remove some sections that were previously called crime prevention through environmental design or crime prevention and safety. These standards are not clear and objective, and they have been found in some communities to be discriminatory. So we are recommending removing them because they tend to be sort of not anti-multifamily, but sort of put multifamily apart as a less desirable land use type. Whereas you can get to these community design standards with your building setbacks, your landscaping requirements, your parking, your lighting, without having to call it crime prevention and safety that's specifically applicable to multifamily. Okay, any questions about that?
Fencing there.
Yes,
Vinyl.
vinyl. Vinyl can be a little controversial. Permitted.
I don't think it's prohibited.
Okay, so adding that.
I mean, yeah, there's new Trex. I mean, there's fake wood, there's different composites that,
So instead of, so it says site obscuring wood, metal, non-chain link, masonry, vinyl, composite, or vegetative screen.
The composite, we didn't cover vinyl.
No, 'cause-
It gives options.
Yep.
It allows people to choices. It's just on the bottom of page 29, these are new exterior lighting standards. And there are a lot of them. We are borrowing this from Hillsborough's code. They have really clear standards. Their images are not clear in the way we copy them over, so we are updating those. So it'll be clear where light trespass is shown and with the fixtures there. Well, I don't think I asked for the fixtures. Fixtures are probably fine. They are.
And they're a little fuzzy, so we might clean up.
Yeah. The Hillsborough code was all in lumens per meter squared, so we changed it over to foot candles. That took a little work for me to figure out what the difference was, but that was your city engineer asking that. I researched it. I got it right. We can check it again. We're making sure that there's no impacts on, since you do have an airport, making sure that we're addressing those types of lighting standards as well. Bottom of, yeah, that's 31, 32, and then we get to the bottom of 32, and that's access and circulation. These are your existing standards. We did add per Scappoose Rural Fire Protection District standards to make sure that our access and circulation on site is going to meet their standards. Page 33. Just clarifying, all parking and loading shall be designed in accordance with the requirements. Changing these section markers since we changed where that information is stored. Middle of the page referring to the Americans with Disabilities Act requirements. To clarify there. Bottom of 33 and top of 34 is just clarifying where and how walkways should be designed to make that clear and objective. And then the top of 35 is walkway construction. This used to say the Planning Commission may also require a 6-foot wide or wider concrete sidewalk in other developments where pedestrian traffic warrants walkways wider than 5 feet. Not clear and objective, and I think your walkway standards do get you an acceptable minimum design. Okay, just rolling forward to chapter 17.130, which is your conditional use chapter. A lot of changes to this chapter, some substantive in that we wanted to mirror your site development review chapter to make sure that when we are not requiring site development review of a conditional use, we're still able to apply those standards and get those projects designed in the way that we'd like to see them designed. So no, we're getting short on time, but if we just kind of scroll through here, any questions about conditional uses? Again, the timing moves from 1 year to 2 years to be able to have that approved. We really did go through and mirror your site development criteria so that we could make sure we were capturing those.
Site development review and conditional use are very, very similar. The one difference is with conditional use, there are additional conditions of approval the Planning Commission could add to make the development, fit better with surrounding uses, basically. Aside from that, they're really, really, really similar.
Unless there are any questions of that, well, maybe we can just hop forward to 45.
Sorry, I do have a question.
Yeah, sure.
Going back to page 40, so what is now B?
40? Okay, let me go
Okay.
there.
Mm-hmm.
8, right underneath 8, before 9, so 11, a change in land use got struck out. So can you just explain?
Oh, sure.
Yeah, oftentimes we'll have, for instance, peak performance, which is out from Sears to peak performance. That's not a great example because the traffic count was a little bit different. But if it's a small change in land use from, say, small retail to a real estate office. Does that really need to kick it back to the planning commission for review or not? And so we were finding that these real small changes in use, they could have the same parking requirements, they could have the same, impact on the neighborhood, but yet that would kick it into a new planning commission review, really slows things down. So, in light of that, we wanted to recognize we're still going to apply all the same standards to that new use. We didn't feel like that in and of itself, especially if it's meeting the zoning, and they can make the parking work. We didn't feel that that in and of itself required the lengthy time to go to planning commission for review.
I had the same question and that clarification is helpful. Maybe could we qualify that? Like when there's a land use change that doesn't necessitate,
That's what this whole section is here.
okay.
Yeah, and so these are the triggers. So B1 through the new number 8, actually through the new number 9, these are the things we are going to review to see if it actually needs to go back for a whole new application again before the planning commission. Yep. And this is going to be really helpful to us to just streamline some of our development approvals in the city. It's like our first step to really having some more opportunity for staff level approval to shorten that approval timeline for applicants. Reduce holding costs on that land as well.
I know we're almost out of time, so I just wanted to mention that the home occupation chapter and the subdivision chapter are also in here. The biggest change there is also the staff level review, I think, where home occupations currently go to planning commission.
Just for
New.
type
Two.
2.
Yeah.
Type 2.
So having those reviewed by staff is really a very common practice. So changing that over.
That was on page 42, 45, starting on page 45.
We'll look at page 45, no changes there. 46, typo. So it's 47. We talked about the home occupation has to be in the house or nobody can be engaged in the business within the home or on the property. So just making it really clear that you can't be in someone's driveway and be like, I'm not in the home occupation, I'm on the driveway. That counts too.
This comes into play when, say, we had someone call recently to clarify, and they had they install hardwood flooring. So they have a home occupation for the home office aspect of it. But when they were filling out the application, they do have employees, but the employees aren't at the home, they're in the field. So we just want to clarify. It's fine if you have employees that aren't in your home, if you're just doing your paperwork, correct. So just a little clarification there.
If there aren't questions about home occupation, maybe we can just scroll to page 54 and just look at what kinds of subdivisions would be reviewed by staff under the proposal.
Sure.
So in this proposal, we do separate out a staff level review for subdivisions. And again, subdivisions are typically residential in nature. You will occasionally get a commercial or industrial subdivision if it's a large piece of land that they're dividing ownership. Typically, subdivisions are residential, so we have to be careful with the clear and objective standards. So the recommendation here is anything that is under 5 acres and less than 20 lots and under 20 dwelling units. So again, you've got your middle housing that could make that number go a lot higher and not subject to any sensitive lands development review. That's going to be a pretty clear and objective review that your staff can do fairly quickly and move that through. The other thing I like about keeping things that don't meet this threshold at the Planning Commission, as I was saying to Lori and other jurisdictions I've worked in, I've liked the cover of having the Planning Commission make those decisions. Sometimes you get over 5 acres or over 20 lots and it becomes more visible, more people in the community want to know about it. They want an opportunity to have a public hearing, that sort of thing. So at some threshold, it is a good idea to have a public hearing. But like I said to Lori, then it becomes, the Planning Commission's job to stick at the clear and objective standards. And staff, of course, are there to remind them of that. But it seems reasonable to have a staff level review.
So I know we're pretty much at time, but I did have a question on page 53 where section D under general provisions was struck out. And so wanted to understand why that section was struck out relating to a 100-year floodplain and dedication of sufficient open land area for greenway.
Yes. Do you want to answer that or do you want me to? Go?
Yeah, you
Yeah,
start and then I
so-
can support.
So the reason I would recommend striking this out is the clear and objective standard, but also, I don't know if you're familiar with Nolan and Dolan and the rough proportionality and essential nexus rules that apply to requiring improvements to be done as part of a land entitlement. And so what those cases say is that if you're going to require something as a city, an improvement to be made that's not part of what's being proposed, you have to show that it has an essential nexus, it's connected, it's somehow supporting that development, but also that it's roughly proportional to the impact that development is placing. And these came out of, one was in Tigard, actually, Dolan, a pathway for a hardware store that they successfully argued at the US Supreme Court that people aren't using a pathway to access their hardware store. Essentially, it's a lot more complicated than that. And so the city had failed to provide a rough proportionality that the amount of impact that they were putting onto the pathway would be coming from the hardware store and make them build that. Nolan was in California. It was a coastal issue that a home was being built and a pathway to the beach was required on their private property for public use. And that was related to there's no essential nexus. You're one home or some level of homes. And it's been 30 years since I've been in school, so forgive me, but essentially it was there wasn't a connection that that house was triggering the need to provide that public good. So this language doesn't meet either of those thresholds. There are ways to write those into the language, but it seemed like with your requirements of having sensitive area buffers and your Parks and Rec plans showing trails and your TSP showing pedestrian connections, you can get at some of these issues using those standards without specifically just asking for it via code without backing it up with those justifications.
Okay. I'll want to come back to that.
Yeah.
Again.
Thank you.
We good?
I know we're out of time, so we will come back to you at some point. We will have more code.
Great. Any quick questions? All right, thank you.
Thank you.